This episode of Shell Phone is sponsored by Mang. Are you on the hunt for functional gear that looks good and gives back? Mang's performance shirts are perfect for fishing, swimming, hiking, and all things outdoors. They're super breathable and lightweight, provide protection from harmful UV rays, and are built to last. Mang's Buy One, Plant One initiative has supported the planting of over 625,000 mangroves in Florida and beyond. Visit mangear.com to shop with the discount code in the description for 10% off and to find out how you can get involved as a volunteer.
Welcome to Shell Phone, the podcast that gives the ocean its very own hotline. Join us as we hear from ocean stewards, discover threats to ocean health, and learn ways we can all answer the ocean's call. This podcast is brought to you in part by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program and Coastal Creative. I'm Harmony Dawson, and joining us this episode is Liberty Boyd. We'll be talking about graduate school, getting into the marine science field, and sea turtle research and conservation. Hi, Liberty. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Harmony. Thank you so much for having me on today as the Shell Phone podcast guest. I'm really excited just to talk about my grad school experience and my sea turtle research. Just a quick introduction about me. I am currently a PhD student at Florida International University in the Height House Lab, and I study green sea turtle movement ecology and foraging behaviors primarily. I started my academic career at Florida Atlantic University, where I attended the Harriet L. Wilkes Honors College, and there I majored in environmental science and marine biology. And while I was in undergrad, I did a couple of internships and volunteer opportunities that really propelled me into my graduate school journey. I always knew that I really loved teaching, and I knew that I needed to be a PhD in order to be a professor at a university to teach what I'm passionate about, which is marine biology. So that was kind of the natural progression into the PhD degree. And I am so close to finishing. I only have about a month left until my dissertation defense. So it's kind of an exciting phase as I'm moving on to the non-student component of my life and finally finishing the college kind of sphere. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's super exciting to be getting towards the end. I was going to ask, what went into the decision to move on to graduate school after undergrad, but you already answered that. So I guess then the first topic we can talk about is how you chose where you wanted to go to grad school, how you went about applying and getting in, and what to look for in a school for marine science.
Yeah, those are all really tough questions, and it takes a lot of soul searching realistically, but also kind of thinking about, what circumstances you're in currently. So I grew up in Florida. This is my home base, and both universities that I went to for undergrad and grad school were here, but I actually didn't really want that. I wanted to kind of expand my horizons, and I applied to so many different graduate schools from California to Boston. I applied to Australia and England. And so I wanted to get like a new, broader experience, but I ended up following the opportunities that kind of just fell into my lap, which ended up being the FIU doctoral program. And the way I got introduced into that was through an internship I did in undergrad. So I was in my sophomore year. I wanted to find a summer internship. And so I simply went onto Google and typed in sea turtle internships because I had just done a volunteering opportunity at the Loggerhead Marine Life Center, which is a sea turtle hospital in Jupiter, Florida, where I went to undergrad. And so that kind of sea turtle experience I wanted to grow, and I really enjoyed the species, so I wanted to learn more about them. So I typed in sea turtle internships into Google, and I found one through the Science Exchange. And that program basically matches students who are looking for internships with different marine biology internships that maybe like a professor or a researcher needs interns for. So they kind of match the two together. And at the time, there was a research program in the Bahamas looking at sea turtle ecology. And the woman who was running the internship was a graduate student at FIU. And so I went as an undergrad, went to the Bahamas, did the internship for the summer, and it was really great working with her as a graduate student because I got to learn firsthand what it's like to be a graduate student, the experiences she was going through, the type of research she had to do for her dissertation research. And then after the internship, we kept in touch. And as I was applying to graduate schools, I naturally reached out to her. She had become a mentor for me. And she said, hey, why don't you apply to my lab? It aligns really well with the type of research you want to do. And she got me connected with her advisor, and then it all kind of fell into place. And so it worked out great. And that was kind of just like a natural progression from that mentorship relationship I had built in my internship. So that was kind of the key thing that gave me that opportunity. And I wouldn't have probably gotten into it had I not made that internship and mentor connection. So I can't express that enough of reaching out to graduate students and other professors to help you kind of explore what options are available in grad school. But at first I was actually kind of debating still too, do I want to go straight into the PhD or should I do a master's first? And like I touched on, I want to really work in the academia sphere and be a professor. And so I knew I would need that PhD, but I did also apply to other master's programs. But a couple key components were the funding that was available through the PhD program, because some master's programs don't have funding incorporated, while many PhD degrees do. So I was funded under a teaching assistantship contract, and then that's what helped pay for it. But also I thought to myself, I'd rather not have to go through more school and through a master's program to kind of get to the same place I would be just going straight into the PhD. I knew it would be a little bit more work and a lot more self-discipline, but I was just ready to kind of commit to it and go full into it. So yeah, that's kind of the sphere of how I ended up where I am in the PhD program.
Awesome. I'm really curious how being in a PhD program differs from other higher education experiences like undergraduate, the typical college experience where it's mostly class-based and following a set guideline of things to do to get that degree. How is what you're doing different?
Yeah, there's definitely some key differences. You think of your bachelor's degree, you're mostly taking classes, right? And so you have your strict schedule of classes, you're taking your exams, you're passing those. So there aren't too many undergraduate programs that kind of incorporate other components, like some of them have an honors thesis or maybe a capstone project that certain programs have that involve a little bit more research based to it, where you're doing a little bit more independent work. But as you move up into those different degrees, you're kind of doing more and more independent research. So the goal of a master's program is to help you learn how to do independent research. And while you're doing a master's program, you're also going to be taking some coursework as well, but it's a bit of a half and half focus. It's coursework and doing some independent research. And there are different master's programs as well. Some of them might have a little bit more of a teaching basis to them, and some of them might have a heavier research side of things. So that's something important to consider when you're applying to master's is it more of like some of them are like masters in professional sciences, MPS degrees. And so that doesn't have as much research, or is it more of a research-based side? And what you want to do in your career, depending on what kind of research or incorporation you want, can kind of help you dictate which one to go. But then the PhD is much more research heavy. So you're doing your dissertation project, which is basically a much larger version of what a master's thesis would be. And then in your PhD program, you also will be taking some coursework, but that's only usually like the first year or so. So you really only have a couple courses that you need to take. And a lot of times if you've done a master's, you can waive some of those course requirements in your PhD and just go straight into the research. And so typically a PhD takes about 4 to 6 years, a little bit more so longer on the marine biology side of things, because a lot of the research has fieldwork components, which just take a little bit more time. And so I think that's one thing that makes it a little bit longer, but you're spending a majority of your time in a PhD doing research. So going out in the field, collecting data, in the laboratory, processing samples, doing data analysis and writing. So that's kind of the big distinctions there between the different degrees and how much time you're dedicating to the different components between coursework and research.
Awesome. Thanks for that rundown. Now that you're getting towards the end of your program, what are some of the things that you've kind of learned throughout the process, or some big key points that you're left with that you'd like to share?
Now that I'm kind of coming to the end of the PhD process, I have kind of come to terms more so with that the marine biology field is always evolving. And you're probably not going to be doing the same thing over and over depending on what phase of a project you're in. So, you think about through a PhD, you kind of start off with formulating your dissertation. You're doing a lot of reading, literature reviews. You might be applying to grants for funding for your project. Then in the middle, that's going to be the fieldwork heavy part, right? You're in the field, you're collecting data, you might be in the lab processing samples. And so that's going to be a different type of work and environment. And then at the end, it's back to the computer. You're doing data analysis on all that precious data you collected in the field, and you're writing it up. And you think about that as you move into a research position in a career, you might have those different phases where you're doing more writing than you're in the field, or you might be doing more lab work than you're doing the other things. So it's going to be a good mix of both at all times, but different careers might have a bit of a more heavy component on one side or the other. So those are kind of important things to consider as you're applying to jobs. And what I'm thinking of now as I'm moving into those new projects and jobs. And I think the other thing kind of on a more personal side of the PhD journey is just the importance of mental health and your own well-being. I think that the PhD journey is so much more put on you. You think about other kind of like higher degrees. Oftentimes I compare to like med school or law school, where it's more coursework heavy. You might be like in the hospital showing skills, or you might be doing like mock defenses for some sort of jury style thing. With the PhD in a research side of things like marine biology or biology or chemistry, you're coming up with your own research project and you're setting kind of the deadlines for yourself. I need to get this research done by this time. It's so much more self-discipline when it comes to putting the research schedule in. So that side of things gets really hard, and you're also faced with a lot of rejection. You're applying to grants and you're getting back no's, or you're applying to submit your paper to a journal and you get rejected. And so those kind of components of failing that isn't getting an F on a test or failing like a skills lab is a bit different, right? And so it kind of weighs on the mental side of things a little bit more. And so, and then you're also hearing back constructive criticism, but still criticism to a degree from your committee. And so you have a group of like 4 or 5 advisors on your team that are guiding you through your dissertation project, and they're coming back with comments and edits for things. And so you have to really build up that mental strength to deal with those new components of school that you have not been exposed to in undergraduate, or maybe even through other phases of your life or different components of it. So being really self-disciplined is tough, and having a strong support system is so, so important to keeping yourself mentally rejuvenated and positive in order to get through the process. So that's been one tough thing that I've had to learn over the past 6 years, especially when you run into unprecedented events like COVID and other things like that. So those can be the challenges that come involved with the PhD process. But that's the negative side of things. There's also a lot of positives, but just a bit of self-learning there that comes with it.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like quite a process throughout the whole timeline to get to where you are now. And it also sounds like those challenges align a little bit more with what you might experience once you get past education and into like your career versus the challenges that you would experience in earlier education. So I'm sure it's priming you a little bit for the future, or a lot, really.
Yes, for sure.
This is kind of a side point, but I did want to ask, you mentioned having a support system is really important. Outside of that, are there other ways that you kind of disconnect and unwind from work, like activities that you like to do, connecting with nature, not related, just ways that you kind of maintain that balance of having your own space outside of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I think some of my ways to kind of unwind would be just like taking some time to enjoy the beach and the ocean. Because when I spend most of my time in the ocean doing field work, it's long, exhausting days swimming and snorkeling. It's like work related. It's still such a fun and enjoyable experience, and so fortunate to have that as part of my life and career, but it is associated with work. So going and snorkeling for fun or just going to the beach for fun really kind of just helps me shift my mentality. And I also did a lot of volunteering with some other groups that were doing field work. So it's not like I have to have the responsibility of doing field work. I can go and assist them with theirs, and not being the one that's like responsible in that moment could just be like so relieving and make you remember why field work you enjoy it so much. So kind of changing my sphere of working in the ocean. But aside from that connection, I like to bake a lot, and I have houseplants that I take care of. So doing some like more around the house things that can kind of just help me unwind. I like to put time into, and then also just trying to remain at the gym and getting my exercise in, and just helping myself feel energized. Trying to maintain just that like healthy living is important just to keep me motivated as well.
So moving back to earlier, you mentioned an internship that you did. The next kind of point that I want to touch on is how to dive into marine science at different points in your life, either through classes that you're taking in high school, internships, volunteering, networking, career searching. These are all things that you talk about a lot on your social media. So I know you have a really good perspective on it. That's a huge topic to just throw at you, but let's start with like internships and maybe volunteering and things like that. Do you have advice for people who are wanting to start doing that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because those are things that I'm really, really passionate about when I share career development with students. It's so much more than just teaching them skills in marine biology. It's how to get there. And I've kind of identified, the key components to having that outside, connection with developing yourself professionally. And that's one of them is experience through volunteering and internships. Mentorship, which comes through that in a way, is really important. Networking, of course, as well, is really, really big. And then research. So those four things are all integrated together through those different components, of course, but each one has its own kind of like nuanced things that you can learn and develop. So going back to internships and experience and volunteering, those are your ways of getting experience, right? And so experience is one of the number one things that people in the marine biology field are looking for, that you've gotten hands-on experience. But more so important to you as a human is getting out and experiencing things in a real world view. You can sit and read a textbook and try and understand what it might be like to be this person in this job or doing this type of skill, but it's not until you actually live it that you realize if you like it or not. So that's one way that I explored my different passions, was just doing internships and volunteering for many different species with many different types of job fields. So it was kind of my goal. And this was something that one of my advisors had told me, was to try and get experience in kind of the different levels of marine sphere. So that's going to be first is academia, right? So doing some sort of volunteering or internship within a university sphere. Then there's the government. So you could work with state agencies or federal agencies like NOAA, which is another place that I did an internship. You can work with nonprofit groups. And so that's going to be more of that grassroots conservation side of things. And then you could also work or intern with private consulting groups. And those are going to be groups that do environmental assessment surveys and stuff like that. So if you can hit a majority of those sides of things, you're going to get a good sphere of the different fields of marine biology. So I had done a couple of internships and volunteering within those things. And summertime is the best time in college to do that, because you're usually not taking classes, but then you can also get college credit for internships sometimes, depending on the program. And then during the school year was when I did a lot of my volunteering work. And so because I had classes, volunteering was great part-time experience, and then things that you could put on your resume or CV that can help you get those internships over the summer. And so the best ways to find out about those types of opportunities is simply Googling. There's so much power in simply Googling, or just looking at organizations around you locally or places that you find interesting and just going into their job tabs or get involved tabs and looking for internships. Following along on different social media channels is really great. I try to post as many internship opportunities as possible through my personal social media accounts, but that's where I also see things that I'm seeing. Oh, this other person shared this internship opportunity, I'm going to share it as well. So those are some great ways to get those kind of internship experiences. And then while you're at your internship or at your volunteering experience, really leaning into the mentorship of your supervisors and continuing with those relationships after those internships or volunteer opportunities have ended. Networking with the other volunteers or interns is so, so important, and trying to build that relationship there. And then, of course, while you're doing your volunteer internship experience, is to really lean into the research side of things, learn those skills, really try and perfect some sort of component and master one of the skills you're learning at that opportunity. So whether that's something in the lab, doing a data analysis skill, doing a data collection fieldwork skill, or maybe trying to perfect your public speaking or writing skills. So find something to really work on with each one of those opportunities that you take advantage of.
Great. On the point about networking and mentorships, that's something that I found I struggle with a lot. Maybe it's because I'm a little more antisocial, but I've found it hard to keep those going after the fact. You can have conversations with people, but I kind of end at a stopping point of, well, what now? What do I come to you for, to kind of get your perspective on? How do I keep that going? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It can be so intimidating, right? Reaching out to someone who you might not know very well to try and connect with them, to talk about job related things. You don't want to come across as annoying, or you don't want to, you might not know exactly what to ask, right? You don't know how they can help you. And so some initial ways that you can kind of build those connections is, finding something that they might be an expert in. Usually they might be specializing in a topic, or they might know something that they're showing you, and just kind of say, hey, I'm really interested in this type of data analysis, or I see that you used to work with this group, or you know so much about this one species, like I have a couple questions I want to ask you. And start with something simple. Start with just like, hey, do you have 5 minutes to answer a question? Kind of get creative with coming up with a question. And then, maybe that might open up to something deeper, or, simply just kind of saying, hey, I would love to pick your brain about career development and future opportunities. I'd like to hear your story. And everyone loves to talk about themselves. So if you kind of ask them to talk about their life experiences, they will open up probably and share their stories. And that might be a way that you might learn something new, either about their experiences or a place they used to work or some sort of research they used to do that you might, get connected with and kind of continue the relationship that way. So kind of just like breaking down walls, getting to know someone on a human level and humanizing the experience, because they're just a person too, whether they might be your, just one person working at this place or the director of this crazy, amazing research place. They're just human. So getting to know them on that level and personalizing the experience can be really helpful. And, also asking to meet in a place like, oh, let's go get a coffee, or, something like that can help too, not just like in a strict laboratory office setting. So kind of breaking down those walls that way. But another thing that I want to mention too quickly is if you can get involved in doing research with them, like a research project, and then sticking around after that research, maybe you're helping with data analysis on something during an internship. And after that 3-month internship, if you still say, hey, I'm still really interested in contributing, maybe volunteer some time on the side, then they might bring you on as potential co-author. You might help go present some of this stuff at a conference. So trying to stick with a type of research after the fact can be really helpful in continuing that relationship too.
I do want to talk a lot more about research and what that looks like, especially with our topic of today, which is sea turtles, but we'll get to that a little more later. Before we move on to talking about sea turtles, I have a little bit more of a specific question when it comes to looking for a job. You talked about searching for those opportunities, but when you come across some opportunities and the requirements are a lot more than maybe what you have, they're looking for a certain number of years of experience or certain degrees. I've heard that if you feel like you'd be a good fit, apply anyway, and those are probably just the on-paper requirements. How do you feel about that? Do you have anything to add to that?
I 100% agree with that. I think that if you feel confident that you can kind of exceed or, meet expectations, and do the job, then there's always going to be a learning curve to any job, right? You're always going to be learning something new at a job. You're not going to come into a new job and just be perfect. So I think that if you meet kind of that minimum requirement of you have the degree they require, or certain those tiny bits of pieces that are kind of like you need to be a citizen of this country or something like that. If you meet those things, I think you should go ahead and apply. And I also think that you could reach out to the maybe organization you're trying to apply with and have time to either meet with one of the people who are doing the interviews or are responsible for that recruitment, and just chat with them and say, this is my experience. Do you think I would fit well? Ask them more questions to show your interest, and that can help too. But I think that you should definitely apply to as many jobs as possible. Maybe if you're not that perfect candidate too. And I think that every time you apply for a job, that's practice. You're practicing your skills on writing a cover letter. If you're fortunate to get an interview, you're practicing your interview skills. So it's exercising that muscle in a way that will strengthen you. If you don't get that one job, now you're better off and more prepared for the next job application. So I think you should apply to as many things as you can. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, if you're ready to move on from the career school side of things, we can dive into talking about what's kind of the focus of your PhD or a lot of the research that you do, sea turtles. First, I'd like to start with just the basics of what are sea turtles, how many species are there, where are they, what habitats do they live in, what do they eat, things like that. Whatever you think is like, this is what you need to know about sea turtles.
Yeah, so basic introduction rundown for sea turtles. Some of the more basic biology components of sea turtles is that they are reptiles, like snakes and lizards, and they lay eggs. They breathe air, even though that they are an aquatic animal that often lives most of their life underwater. So that's something that have to consider as they constantly are needing to come up to the surface to breathe. And they can indeed survive outside of the water for long periods of time. It's really just that access to food that limits their ability to stay out of water for a long time. So there are 7 species worldwide. There's the largest, which is the leatherback sea turtle. You've probably seen some beautiful pictures of them. They're stunning, very striking in appearance. And they're the only turtle that has a soft shell. And so they are black and they're speckled with white colors. They look very different than any other sea turtle species. Then you have kind of your other picturesque kind of turtles that you often see are going to be those green sea turtles. Green sea turtles are primarily herbivorous, but there are some populations that are omnivorous, but they primarily eat seagrass and algae. There's going to be the loggerhead sea turtle. They will mostly live in seagrass and reef habitats, and they eat shelled kind of organisms. You'll get those crabs, conch, lobster, other things like that. Then we have hawksbill sea turtles. Hawksbills mostly live on reefs. They're also critically endangered. They will mostly eat sponges, but also can eat algae and different coral species as well. Then there's the olive ridley turtle. Olive ridley mostly live around the equator and tropical waters. There's the Kemp's Ridley turtle, and that's a smaller version. And this turtle is actually one of the most endangered of the turtle species. They live in the Gulf of Mexico primarily, but they also can kind of range up the eastern coast of the United States. Then the last turtle is the flatback turtle. It's listed as data deficient, so we don't actually have enough information about this species to properly assess its conservation status. Likely they are very critically endangered if we were to properly assess them. They are mostly found in Australia, in that region of the world. But yeah, there's not a lot that we know about them and their behavior. So there's still so much to learn about sea turtle species and the diversity of them and their various ecological behaviors. And that's what I find so interesting about them, is that while they are this charismatic species that many people think of when they think of marine animals, there's still lots of questions related to some of them, and their populations in certain areas based on the species are critically endangered. So it's important to really focus on researching them and how different effects of climate change and changing environments will impact their overall ecology and population status.
I think it's really interesting that these turtles are so different from each other in some ways. If I didn't know anything about them, I might just think they all just look a little different, maybe live in different places, but they might eat the same types of things and behave in really similar ways. But it really seems like that's not the case at all. But as you said, there's so much more to learn, even for people who do know all of those little details about sea turtles and the different species. I also wanted to jump off the point of conservation status. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I read that sea turtles are all protected under the Endangered Species Act, but that is different than their literal conservation status. So some are more threatened than others. What does it mean to be protected under the Endangered Species Act?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Because these animals exist globally and have very large migration scales. So the Endangered Species Act is obviously a United States-based law. And while there are international protections in different spheres, the same types of protections that are implemented under the Endangered Species Act only applies to U.S. waters. So the turtle that migrates between here and Mexico or between here and Africa have completely different conservation laws between those different areas. So no matter, we could have the best conservation in the world here in Florida or somewhere else, they go to a new country and suddenly they're not under the same protection. So the Endangered Species Act has a list of different organisms that have conservation concern. And there are also, for sea turtles, subpopulations. Not every animal has that type of subpopulation classification scheme. So for example, the green sea turtle, that has different subpopulations. So there's like the North Atlantic population, the South Pacific, and those usually don't cross. But so they have different kind of conservation statuses. But just because it's listed as the Endangered Species Act, they could be listed as threatened on a global scale. So there is that little bit of change there, but under the Endangered Species Act, there's 6 species of turtles that are considered because the flatback turtle only really exists in Australia. So, but the Endangered Species Act is very important because it does give a basis of conservation implementations and management policies to abide by, considering, no take or harm, molestation, especially protecting nests for eggs of marine turtles. So there's that component. But there's also state-related policies as well. So there's the federal, within the national sphere, but each state also has their own policies. So when you're applying to research permits, you might have to deal with different permitting schemes based on what state you're in. And then also depending on what species you're working with, you'll have to get separate components from the National Marine Fisheries Service. And then also for example, here in Florida, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. So there's lots of laws and protections that come into play in that sphere when it comes to their conservation and protection. But yeah, like I said, that's just here in the United States where I live. And so it's really important to connect the dots between these turtles that are moving between different countries and how internationally we can create policies to protect them in their entire range of movement and life.
That's definitely a big thing with policy. It's very multi-layered and can be confusing to piece together. And that also, this is a little bit random, but that made me think of marine protected areas where a specific area is protected, but a lot of migratory species move through them. And what would it look like if a bunch of different marine protected areas were all connected, or if they were big enough to be connected and then actually benefit those migratory species? That just brought me back to that. It's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, and that's what makes studying sea turtles so complex is they have their fine scale habitat, maybe their home range and a foraging site, and then they say, hey, time to make our yearly migration for nesting, and they move to a whole new area. So you have to consider all of those components. And many other taxa have that as well. You think humpbacks whales, they move north, south based off of mating seasons and foraging. And so it's a very complex issue. And that's why having to look at them from these fine scale components to large scale migrations and understand that whole component makes it challenging.
I'm curious about the distance that these sea turtles travel between those different sites and how big of a area they are traveling between in their lives.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the turtle that has the largest range of movement is the leatherback turtle. They can range and migrate between the Caribbean all the way up to the Northeast United States and almost into those kind of Arctic. They don't go full Arctic, but those really cold waters up in the north, depending on the season. So they're making cross ocean migrations. But then there's also populations of, for example, green sea turtles, where they might be moving between a foraging ground and a nesting site. And we might not have mentioned this yet, but turtles will return to their natal nesting beaches to mate and nest. So the beach that they were born on, they're going to return to when it's time for them to lay their eggs. And males, they follow that same pattern, but they might distribute themselves a little more broadly. But females particularly will follow that pattern a lot more. So they might have a smaller range, so they might be moving between like a nesting beach in Florida and then move down to the Florida Keys where they're going to be grazing and foraging. And then when it's time to mate, they might move back up the coast of Florida. But some of them make migrations all the way back to Africa, and then they might come back to here. So it just really depends on that subpopulation, where it was born. And so they could be making those cross-ocean migrations as well. But there are kind of pockets of different genetic groups that were born in different places that kind of ended up in the same foraging ground that they'll continue to return to. But there's still so much more tracking data that's needed to fully understand their migrations. So that's one kind of component to it. I would say more on the smaller side of the home range is going to be maybe hawksbill turtles. They typically will go to rookeries, and specifically in the Atlantic Ocean. There's other examples globally, but in the Atlantic Ocean and Caribbean, they'll go to small islands in the Caribbean to nest primarily, and then they might distribute throughout the Caribbean, but they typically don't make those huge ocean migrations, this rookery kind of population in the Caribbean. So that's kind of more of a smaller scale that typically doesn't have those cross ocean migrations. But yeah, they definitely vary based on species and how far they travel.
So in preparation for this episode, I was listening to an episode of the podcast Ologies, which also is kind of funny because that relates to your social media handle.
Was this with Cameron Allen?
Yes.
Yeah, she was the person I worked with at NOAA's Sea Turtle Research Group in Hawaii. So
when I saw that you had worked there, I kind of made that connection too. I was like, I wonder if
she is the queen of sex ratios and that area of research.
Yeah. So in that episode, they talked a lot about the impacts of climate change on sea turtles and brought up a lot of points. I knew kind of about the sex of hatchlings depending on temperature, but a couple other points that they brought up had to do with deaths from cold stuns and also more intense storms impacting nesting areas when they reach land. So if you kind of want to jump into that and whatever point you'd like to share about first. There are also lots of human impacts on sea turtles, but we'll get to that next.
Yeah, so climate change is a very complex issue when it comes to the ecology of sea turtles and how it's going to impact their conservation. Temperature in particular is a really interesting component to the life of a sea turtle. First off, they have temperature determined sex ratios in their eggs. So when they lay their eggs in the beach, you kind of think of it as hot chicks and cool dudes. So warmer temperatures will impact the sex and make it female, and then the cooler temperatures will make it male. So when you think of a nest in the sand, probably the warmer temperatures are going to be at the top, going to be coming from the sun irradiating the sand, and then cooler temperatures at the bottom, and then also around the edges. So that kind of creates that ratio of males to females in that nest. But as temperatures increase due to climate change and global warming, nests are going to become hotter overall. So there's this fear that the feminization of populations will occur, decreasing genetic diversity and the ability to have more offspring and lay more eggs. So that's a big concern. Also, when it comes to temperature, sea turtles are reptiles. So they're ectotherms. They can't regulate their body temperature. So the ambient water temperature impacts their capacity to just function biologically. So when it's really cold, often what we call a cold stunning event. Maybe this is brought on by likely some sort of cold front over an area, or the temperature drops really quickly. Turtles can't move their body the same way. They go into a hibernative state almost, where their body starts to shut down. And so they will often float to the surface, remain at the surface, and either get washed up onto beaches or something like that. So when there's a cold stunning event, people will often go out into the ocean, try and find those turtles and bring them to some sort of rehab facility. So, but the key component is how quickly that onsets. They can start to kind of feel the temperature dropping. They might start migrating south where it might be warmer if we're in the northern hemisphere. And so, but what's really interesting in Cape Cod, for example, is it's kind of that hook shape in Massachusetts. And so as they start to get it cold, they're like, oh, we're going to swim south to get warmer, but then they get stuck in that hook, and then they can't, their reaction isn't to swim north again to go over. So they just keep getting stuck in that elbow. And that's where that in Cape Cod, that phenomena is very prominent. So that's a big component as well. And so turtles will unfortunately die from that, but the big volunteering communities are a huge way to save those species and those individuals impacted by the cold stunning events. And then kind of touching on storms and how that impacts nesting beaches. So we are seeing it live. We are seeing hurricanes in the Caribbean get stronger and stronger every year and more frequent. And the big concern there is going to be storm surges. So, and that wave activity and beach erosion that comes from the storms as it relates to sea turtle nesting. So once a nest gets inundated by water, so the waves wash up and the nest becomes wet, the eggs can't be viable anymore. They're not going to survive. Also, if the wave activity is strong enough to the point where it's eroding the beaches and actually eroding that nest apart, it's going to unfortunately harm those eggs as well, and they won't be able to survive. So those factors impact the ability for these nests to survive. And these nests are in the sand for, depending on the species, 60 to 100 days. And so a turtle can come, and then 2-3 months later, a hurricane comes, and those eggs are almost ready to go and hatch, and that entire beach is going to be wiped out from that storm. So it can impact a generation of turtles, especially in high density nesting beaches. For example, Southeast Florida has so many nests, especially. So that's why sometimes you'll see different conservation groups going and actually digging up nests before storms and moving them into a safe location until the storm has passed. I think they actually just did that recently with Hurricane Beryl. I think it was in Texas, or Mexico, they were moving nests. So that's one way that you can help prevent that issue. But with the increasing storms and frequency of them, that just becomes a lot more challenging.
I have so many questions that I want to dive into. I feel like I could just keep asking you about this topic forever. One random question before I get back to my connected question. Do sea turtles, after they hatch, are they just on their own? Do they stay in groups? Do they have parental supervision?
Turtles are completely on their own. They they likely will never see their mom or dad again. And so each turtle is kind of out for its own. They do have kind of a mass nesting emergence that happens where all the hatchlings will emerge at the same time. But after that, they are kind of on their own and using their senses to find the ocean and then swim out. And then, they're on their own. And when they're so little, they're really up to the dictation of the ocean currents, and that's where they're going to determine where they end up. So they're too small. They can't swim against the currents. It's also just not energetically effective to try and swim. They'll use up all their energy trying to swim against the currents. So they'll flow in the currents, and then that will distribute them somewhere in the ocean basin. And then that's where they'll kind of grow up in their nursery sites until they're ready to make their migration back to their natal beach. So realistically, their mom is nesting at that beach, so they might come into contact with their mom again, potentially in the future. But in general, turtles are very solitary. They're not going to be really getting together unless they're trying to mate. There isn't too much documentation about social components or connections. We do see aggression based off of competition, but not anything related to making connections with an individual for some sort of social component. I'm so curious about that. I would love to do more research on that. But yeah, typically it's more competition based or mating related. So they're on their own.
I'm not sure if there's an easy answer to this because climate change is not an easy issue to tackle. And you can look at it from like the bigger perspective of how we can counteract climate change. But on the smaller scale, how is that issue and its impacts on sea turtles being approached by conservationists?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is after, all of these threats of climate change and storms, what can we actually do to help the turtles, right? The biggest things are going to be protecting our coastlines from erosion and implementing more beach restoration is one way, more not super turtle direct, but making sure that our coastlines will sustain erosion. Also protecting key nesting areas. You can take nests and bring them to nursery locations where they can emerge in a kind of protected environment, also protected from other threats like coastal pests like raccoons, that kind of thing. So those are some ways is more research into how to, take nests and relocate them if they're in a particular threatened area. I also think that more research can be done on just tracking turtles in general, really understanding where they're going and how a storm activity might change their movement behavior. As a storm comes close, are they being able to detect that storm in the water? Are they moving to a new location? Are they staying in that location? We do see that turtles, I think there was some documentation in the Bahamas with some hurricanes that they would go further up into creek systems, those kind of like estuary areas. So they would go further into those locations for protection, but definitely more research on where they're going because of a storm and if they're migrating out of those areas is needed. But definitely something to understand better is their capacity to predict a storm coming and moving to a new protected area.
Moving on from the impacts of climate change on sea turtles, there are also lots of more directly human impacts on sea turtle behavior and health. These have to do with some things like tourism, fishing, pollution, so many different things. And that would be a whole other conversation. But for now, let's move on to sea turtle research. This can look a lot different depending on what specifically you're trying to gather. But what can that look like? Maybe in your own experience, what does that look like either in the field, in the lab, after the fact?
Yeah. Sea turtle research is really complex and has a lot of components to it, depending on what species you're researching, what aspect of their life cycle you're researching, and then just different types of behaviors that you might want to look at. So obviously you could look at a different type of species, which is just like the one component to it. But one of the big distinctions is going to be that nesting research versus in-water research. Nesting research just has a little bit more accessibility, and that's why it's a bit more documented in the relative scheme of sea turtle research, because the turtles come up onto the beaches, you can take samples from them, you can monitor their genetic material, can track the eggs that are coming out and just the success of those hatchlings. So that's one big component. And then the in-water component is a bit more challenging just because you're going to have to observe them in their natural environment under the water, which has a bit more challenges involved when it comes to tracking, catching them, and then just observing their behaviors. And that's where a lot of big technological advances come in to tracking those turtles' behaviors, like movement tags, like satellite tags or passive acoustics. You could also use like animal-borne camera tags, which is an area that I have gone into looking at sea turtle behavior. And then also just doing some camera deployments passively to sea turtles in their environment. And then as well as catching the turtles to put those tags on them is a whole nother component. And then aside from that, some other big questions and areas of research is their health. When it comes to diseases, there's a sea turtle tumor disease that is very prevalent in different species, more so in green sea turtles. And so kind of looking at the different disease components of that. And then really understanding the, more like genetics makeup of these different populations, because they're such a migratory species, how they're all connected between different populations and subpopulations. And so, yeah, I think that some of the big areas and research gaps that we're really trying to understand as a community is the effects of climate change and how temperature will impact the distribution of turtles, the sex ratios of turtles, and their capacity for just function as temperature changes and storms. We're also really trying to understand their foraging ecology, what makes them choose certain seagrass beds or reefs over others. And that's important because as seagrass communities decline and reefs globally are declining, how are they going to alter their decisions on where to forage and where to go for their foraging sites and selection? So really trying to understand that component of their life will be key to predicting how future populations may change and habitat selection. And then also trying to understand just their overall impact from an anthropogenic side of things, how bycatch, pollution, human disturbance are impacting their distribution and behavior are some really big areas that are developing in the sea turtle community.
That was a really great overview. Thank you. I am curious, since we've talked a lot about the movement and distribution and those aspects of sea turtle ecology, you mentioned some methods of different tools that can be used. Is there like one method that's the method for tracking, like the standard for tracking sea turtles, or the most used? Or if you want to take a different take on the question, maybe the most exciting new method that you think could really be the standard in the future?
Yeah, I'm really happy you asked this question because this is kind of the entire basis of my dissertation project, is looking at movement ecology of green sea turtles. And I use a couple different technologies in my research chapters to evaluate their movement behavior. My major focus was looking at fine scale movement. So what that means is in a small area, where are they moving on a day-to-day basis, and what are the factors that influence their movement decisions? And in order to get that, you need high resolution tracking data, right? So there are kind of a couple methods you could use. One method is going to be satellite tags. And satellite tags, based on the type of tag, have different ranges of accuracy. So most tracking for migrations will have more broad scale because they don't need to invest in those more expensive tags that track really fine scale locations. And then there's different types of satellite tags for resolution. So I have been using what's called a fast lock GPS tag, and that actually uses a type of satellite GPS similar to the way your phone has tracking, as opposed to the other satellite tags, which use a different kind of method for satellite location. So whether you want fine scale or broad scale is really important. Then there's going to be tracking not through satellites, and you can do in-water tracking through passive acoustic telemetry. And basically how that works is a turtle is tagged with a little transmitter that emits a signal, and a acoustic receiver picks up that signal. And it's a unique signal based off of that unique tag. So if you tag a couple different turtles in one location, it can pinpoint which tag is emitting that signal. And then you can also increase the scale of your ability to detect turtles on how many receivers you have. So if you have an array of receivers, you can then actually triangulate the position to give a real-time kind of fine scale location, as opposed to you just have one receiver and it says, oh, the turtle is in with this general area of this receiver. Or you could have that array, which has more fine scale component. But of course, that comes with cost and efficiency. So the more receivers, the more money. And so that kind of limits the capacity for collecting fine scale data. So I actually used in my dissertation chapter a fine scale acoustic array to triangulate positions in a small coastal bay. So that's one way that we were able to track exactly where the turtle was moving in high accuracy resolution over a long period of time. So really the limitations are spatial resolution, how much tags and the technology costs, and also how long that these systems can be implemented for. So the battery life of a tag will determine how long it's emitting a signal for, which then obviously limits how long your data is being collected.
My final question, even though like I said earlier, I could go on forever, do those methods, have you seen them kind of have an impact on the individual turtles themselves in any way? Like, is there like a drawback in that sense?
Yeah, so part of research permitting is making sure that whatever type of tag you're putting on a turtle is not going to negatively harm the turtle, right? And that's going to dictate the size of the tag based on the size of the turtle. So if you put a really big tag on a really little turtle, that's obviously going to have a much more impact if you put a smaller tag on a smaller turtle. And so you think about hydrodynamics, and tags are definitely designed to not cause a lot of drag on a turtle. So those aspects are important. But overall, these tags aren't necessarily going to impact turtles, primarily because they're attached externally. Other movement tags, like passive acoustic tags for different species, can actually be surgically implanted. So with fish and sharks, passive acoustic tags are surgically implanted, but for turtles, that isn't a method that's been implemented through permitting yet. So they're all externally attached, which is much less invasive. Not that the other methods are bad for those species, and they've been tested and are fine for those species, but it just hasn't been implemented yet for sea turtles. So there's not too much negative harm there. So really it's making sure that the tag size is appropriate for the size turtle you have, and that it's not going to create too much drag. I think at the beginning they definitely noticed that something has been attached to them, depending on how big the tags are. You know, some of the tags are really tiny. Some of the big camera systems are a bit larger. So they definitely noticed them. Making sure that they're neutrally buoyant is important. Some tags have a float on it, so after it detaches from the turtle, it'll float to the surface so that the researcher can collect it afterwards, like a video tag setup. And making sure that when the tag is attached, you can put some extra weights on there so that it's neutrally buoyant, so the turtle's not kind of getting brought up back to the surface a lot. So that's a challenging aspect as well, is making sure you have everything balanced correctly for the turtle. But in general, no, the tags aren't harmful to them. It's not going to hurt them. It's maybe just a little bit extra weight that they feel, but after, a period of time, it's not something that they notice or it changes their behavior. So a lot of research will exclude kind of that first couple hours that a tag has been deployed to remove any bias from post-capture handling and just getting used to that tag. So, and there's been some studies on what that kind of appropriate time to exclude data is. But overall, no, not too much or not really any negative harm for the turtles. Otherwise, it wouldn't be permitted, right?
Yeah, definitely. That I really wanted to ask just because as somebody somebody from outside of the science world, that might be a concern, especially with how charismatic sea turtles are and how well loved they are. But your answer was really interesting. It added more to my understanding of the technology as well, which is great. And that kind of brings us to the end of the episode. So thank you so much for coming to talk with me. I learned so much, and I'm probably gonna bring myself to learn more about this topic.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you had me on. I love getting to talk about just kind of career development in the marine biology field. And of course, talking about turtles all day I could do. So it's been such a pleasure being on as well. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Awesome. Thanks for tuning into Shellphone. To learn more about our projects, suggest a guest, or donate to the show, visit our website at breachthesurface.org or social media at Breach the Surface and at Shellphone Podcast. You can follow Liberty at Libertyology on Instagram and TikTok to learn more about her work and hear more advice for your own journey into marine science. This episode of Shellphone is sponsored by Mang. Are you on the hunt for functional gear that looks good and gives back? Mang's performance shirts are perfect for fishing, swimming, hiking, and all things outdoors. They're super breathable and lightweight, provide protection from harmful UV rays, and they're built to last. Mang's Buy One, Plant One initiative has supported the planting of over 625,000 mangroves in Florida and beyond. Visit manggear.com to shop with the discount code in the description for 10% off and to find out how you can get involved as a volunteer.